Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 6 in our review and response to Mr. Joel Richardson's book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. Now, I have to give you just a little bit of an update about this entire situation. Just recently, over the last week or so, I went to Mr. Richardson's Twitter feed, and I extended an invitation to him to meet me in formal public debate or even a YouTube debate on the issue of Babylon. His response was that I was arrogant, I was condescending, and I was dishonest. I have to admit I was taken back by those accusations. And so I asked him how it was that in my videos he could accuse me of being condescending and arrogant and disrespectful, dishonest, what have you, when I had gone out of my way. And you can go back in the previous videos from today, and you can see that I'd gone out of my way to say that I meant absolutely no disrespect to Mr. Richardson. I was simply questioning the conclusions that he makes in his book. And he said, his response was that as a preterist, I am a complete heretic because, among other things, I deny that Jesus is human in any way at all. Well, that's a blatantly false accusation. When I challenged Mr. Richardson to document that claim, that I and preterists do not believe that Jesus is now human in any way at all, he promptly said that my challenge for him to document his claim was proof of my dishonesty and proof of my arrogance, and he promptly blocked me from his Twitter feed. Now I want to ask you, if someone were to make a false accusation against you and you ask them to document, to provide proof for their accusation, would that be dishonest? Would that be arrogant? Would that be condescending? Or would that simply be asking for the individual to prove what they had claimed? I was stunned at Mr. Richardson's rather vitriolic response to my challenge for him to prove that his accusation, his false accusation, was in fact true. It's really just a sad situation that Mr. Richardson feels so uncomfortable, feels so weak in his own position that he has to strike out by making false accusations. Well, enough of that. We continue our examination of his claim that Babylon of Revelation was none other than the Islamic Caliphate, a revived Islamic Caliphate, and that Mecca in Saudi Arabia is Babylon. Now, in chapter 6, begin page 64, he says, "We now turn to another of the most critical clues concerning the identity of the harlot Babylon. Despite the importance of this clue, most interpretations of the harlot seem to completely miss it," unquote. On the next page, he said, "With regard to the harlot Babylon, the Lord has given us precisely the same kind of brazenly obvious clue. Yet for some reason, virtually every commentary I've read has missed it. And that obvious clue, according to Mr. Richardson, is that on the forehead of the harlot, she had Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the abomination of the earth." And he says, quote, "It doesn't get any more direct than this. If there had been neon lights in the first century, perhaps the Lord would have hung a blinking neon sign around her neck. Do you understand this? The Lord obviously wants us to get this clue. Unquote. Well, I agree. But then Mr. Richardson proceeds to tell us that the mother of harlots, number one, refers to anyone that worships idols or false religion. And he jumps from that to Islam and Mecca. Well, I could spend about a week talking about that, but let me make a couple of observations very quickly. First of all, Mr. Richardson is correct that the word harlot refers to spiritual infidelity, spiritual adultery. It's not referring to physical adultery. But here is where we find the tremendous hermeneutical fallacy of Mr. Richardson. Point number one, he completely and totally ignores the Old Testament background. Now, when I say completely ignores, he references Exodus chapter 34. But what I mean by that is, he completely overlooks the fact that John is drawing from Ezekiel, from Jeremiah, from the other Old Testament prophetic books in the book of Revelation. His source for his reference, therefore, to the harlot is to be found in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, here's something that you absolutely must catch the power of this. In the Old Testament, the word that is translated as harlot is used 91 times. Here's what you have to catch. 86 times. 86 out of 91 times, the word harlot is used in the Old Testament, in the majority of times, in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, by the way, books that John draws from extensively. 86 out of the 91 times, the word harlot is used to refer to Old Covenant Jerusalem. Not foreign nations, not pagan nations. In fact, there are only 2 times in the entirety of the Old Testament in which the term harlot refers to any city other than Jerusalem. Only 2 times. And both of those cities had a covenant with Jerusalem. Do you catch the power of that? Point number 2, not only does John draw from the Old Testament, Ezekiel, Jeremiah extensively, this will be point number 3, I guess, and number 2, as we just noted, Jeremiah and Ezekiel use the term harlot 86 out of 91 times to refer to Old Covenant Jerusalem. Number 3, the word harlot is not used simply of a woman that was loose in her morals. No, the word harlot in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and the other prophetic books is used of a wife that had broken the marriage covenant. In other words, Jerusalem, Israel. In the book of Hosea, it refers to the 10 northern tribes. She had played the harlot. And as a result of that, God had divorced her. Hosea 2, 1-3. Hosea 2, 1-3. Do you catch the power of that? So here is John in the book of Revelation drawing from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the word for harlot is used of Jerusalem. And number 3, the word harlot, when speaking of Jerusalem and the 10 northern tribes, it is referring to the bride of Yahweh that had violated the marriage covenant. For Mr. Richardson to come to the New Testament, the book of Revelation, that draws from Hosea, that draws from Jeremiah, that draws from Ezekiel, that used the term harlot not to refer to the pagan nations, but to refer to Old Covenant Jerusalem, to refer to a spiritual wife that had broken the marriage covenant, is completely anachronistic. It violates the harmony, the unity, and the consistent use of that imagery. And let's not forget this. At least 3 different times in his ministry, Jesus referred to Jerusalem and Judea and the Jews of his day as a wicked and adulterous generation. Adulterous? Yes, because she was married to Yahweh, but she was violating the marriage covenant. Listen to me very carefully. The Islamic Caliphate was never married to Yahweh. Since she was never married to Yahweh, never had a marriage covenant, then she could not play the harlot, which goes back to the fact in the Old Testament, 86 out of 91 times, the word harlot refers to a wife that had violated the marriage covenant. Does Mr. Richardson even mention any of this? No. Does he mention the fact that Jerusalem and Judea and the Jews of Jesus' generation were called an adulterous generation? No. In other words, while Mr. Richardson, ridicules the commentaries for ignoring the fact that Babylon was a harlot, guess what? He is the one that is guilty of ignoring the Old Testament background of the term, the covenantal nature of the term, and Jesus' own declaration that Jerusalem of his day was an adulterous generation. Instead, Mr. Richardson anachronistically jumps forward 2,000 years and claims that the Islamic Caliphate that was never married to Yahweh, never had a marriage covenant with Yahweh, therefore could not be an adulterous wife, he claims she or it is Babylon of Revelation. I'm sorry, folks. That is a horrible, I mean no disrespect, I am simply addressing the doctrine. But that is a horrible hermeneutic, especially in light of what we discussed last week when John was told over 30 times in the book of Revelation that fulfillment of the book was at hand. Look, Islam didn't come along for 600 years. That was not and is not at hand, must shortly come to pass. When you couple the imminence of fulfillment of the book of Revelation with the first century reality of Judah, Jerusalem, as the adulterous generation, the adulterous wife, coupled with the Old Testament use of harlot, it is a total repudiation, a total falsification of the claims of Mr. Joel Richardson. He didn't unravel any mystery at all. He was guilty of an anachronistic hermeneutic and of ignoring the biblical evidence. And that's not the way to do biblical exegesis. If you want to see an exploration of all of this, get a copy of my book, Who is This Babylon? Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, order the book, send me a note that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll pay your shipping. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you on Monday.